Welcome to the Four Lakes Church of Christ meeting here in Madison, Wisconsin. We're glad to have you with us for our midweek Bible study. Today we are continuing in our study of the book of Judges, so we want to invite you to be joining us in Judges chapter 5 in just a moment. As always, if you have any questions, any comments about today's class, if you have something that we need to be praying about as a church, we want to invite you to reach out, get in touch. You can send a message to me at info@fourlakeschurch.org. You can also call or send a text to 608-224-0274. By way of very brief review, we're several chapters into this, but we need to understand that the judges in the book of Judges are not the kind of judges that we might picture in our minds today when we hear the word judges, but they are deliverers. So they are men, and in this case, a woman who comes in at the last moment to rescue God's people from oppression. So they are exactly what was needed at the moment. And we should also point out here at the beginning yet again that in the book of Judges we will see a pattern that's going to repeat itself over and over and over again throughout this book. And so we start up at the top with things going well. They have peace, there's prosperity, the economy is humming along, people are getting along with one another. However, because things are going so well, the people start drifting away from God. And so the idea is kind of behind the scenes, and I don't even know if they may say this, but this is the way it behaves. This is the way it comes out. We're strong. We don't need God's help anymore. Look, the economy's wonderful, and so they slip away into sin. And God then sends an enemy. Somebody comes in and overwhelms them. It brings the people back to reality. They then call for God to help. And they turn to God in repentance. We're so sorry for the things that we've done and so on. And God then sends a judge to deliver his people from that oppression. And so things settle down. They prosper again. This goes on for 10, 30, 40, 80 years or so. And the cycle repeats itself over and over again. Well, one major theme in the book is found in the very last verse, where the text says that in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And I think that reminds us that they were not following God's law in those days for the most part, but instead everybody pretty much did whatever they wanted to do. There was no national conscience, but they had completely left God, and they would kind of drift in and out of that cycle. By way of very brief review, we have the first three judges already in chapter 3. Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. Last week we then looked at Deborah in chapter 4. We learned that Deborah was pretty much solving problems. She was the fixer. She got things done. And we learned that the people were being oppressed by Jabin, a local king, the king of the Canaanites, I believe, and they have been oppressed by this guy for 20 years. We learned in the text last week that Jabin has 900 iron chariots. That was almost unheard of, very rare in the ancient world in those days, and Jabin's main military commander is a guy by the name of Sisera. Well, God tells Deborah to tell Barak, this Israelite military leader, to go to war with Sisera. Well, he seems kind of reluctant, so Barak agrees to go, but only if Deborah goes with him. So it's kind of a strange request right there. Well, Deborah allows that, but she lets Barak know that the glory of defeating the enemy will not go to him, but it's going to go to a woman. And we noted last week we might have expected that woman to be Deborah, but that's not what happens, is it? Barak leads the people in battle. They kill everybody but Sisera, the commander, who flees to the tent of a foreign woman named Jael. Jael invites him in, allows him to rest for a little bit, and then nails his head to the floor with a tent peg. And that is how God uses a woman to defeat these people. So something from completely out of the blue, something you almost just couldn't make up, but kind of a unique situation they'd never seen before. And God ultimately delivers his people from this particular enemy. So this is the story of Deborah the judge. We've read everything that there is to read about, from the text itself, the narrative part of it. However, although the event itself is now completed, Deborah and Barak follow up by apparently writing and or singing a song together. So they're going to commemorate this event, and that brings us to Judges chapter 5. And so let's jump into it in our midweek study this week with Judges chapter 5, and the first paragraph is verses 1 through 5. So Judges chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. Then Deborah and Barak the son of Abinoam sang on that day, saying, that the leaders led in Israel, that the people volunteered, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O rulers. To the Lord, I will sing. I will sing praise to the Lord, the God of Israel. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth quaked, the heavens also dripped, even the clouds dripped water. The mountains quaked at the presence of the Lord, this Sinai at the presence of the Lord, the God of Israel. So again, we find here that Deborah and Barak sing this song together. They are commemorating the victory over Jabin. That's what's going on here. They defeated Jabin, the king of the Canaanites, this guy with the 900 iron chariots. And so they are singing a song to remember this. And I would kind of ask, do we still sing songs to commemorate military victories even today? Well, of course we do. The first one that came to mind for some reason was the Marine Hymn. And from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our country's battles in the air, on land, and sea, and so on. So there we have it. I think they had just the anniversary, birthday, whatever you want to call it, here this week, I believe. And so maybe we've got Marines on the mind. Our national anthem, I think, concerning the War of 1812, even today, by the dawn's early light, all of that. So it's commemorating a military victory. Oh, Johnny Horton, the Battle of New Orleans. That's another one. I like Johnny Horton, kind of an interesting singer there. But I'm just saying, we sing songs even today to commemorate great battles, and that is what is going on here. So if they sing this song, then maybe it'll stick, and people will remember it, and that'll get passed down through the years. And here we are in October 2025, and we're still reading the words of this song. So Deborah the judge, Barak the military commander, sing this song together to commemorate their victory over the Canaanites. They start in verse 2 by praising those who volunteered. So I just kind of want to emphasize here, these people are not drafted. They were not forced into this, but in this situation, they were called upon. And certain Israelites answered the call. Some did, some did not. We'll get back to that in just a moment. But Deborah and Barak praise God for those who volunteered. Notice in verse 3, they make it clear they are singing to God. They want all kings and rulers of the world to understand this. This song will hopefully remind other kings in the area what God will do through his people. And so they continue, it seems, with, I would say, maybe some background material. This doesn't seem to be what happened on that day. And so it's kind of a little unclear to me, I suppose, if verses 4 and 5 refer to this event or to what happened in years past. I'm leaning toward this applying to years past. And I say that because to me it almost seems like a summary of God's previous victories over the Edomites, and maybe even a reference to God delivering the law on Mount Sinai with the quaking and all of that. But these are the opening lines of this song, kind of praising the volunteers who fought, and then reminding the area kings that God has this amazing history of victory over his enemies. So don't mess with us. We're on God's side, I think is kind of the message that's being communicated here. So let's continue with Judges chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. Judges 5, 6 through 8, the next paragraph here. In the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and travelers went by roundabout ways. The peasantry ceased, they ceased in Israel, until I, Deborah, arose, a mother in Israel. New gods were chosen. Then war was in the gates. Not a shield or a spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. Well, in verse 6, we have a very brief reference to Shamgar. You may remember from when we studied Shamgar a few weeks ago, I said he's only mentioned once in the Bible, except for one other brief reference in Judges 5. And so here we are, we're already to it. So as Deborah and Barak sing about their victory, they think back to the previous judge. And to me, it seems as if they're talking about the time between Shamgar and Deborah. So there was Shamgar, now there's Deborah. So in those years in between, and I say that because they also mention Jael in here. And so in those in-between years, as the people were working their way through that cycle that we've mentioned every week, there was a time when people were scared to leave their homes. Doesn't that seem like what's going on here? They're scared to go anywhere. And so commerce comes to a close. The streets are deserted. When people did travel, they took roundabout ways, so they took detours to avoid the violence and chaos. It almost sounds like some kind of zombie movie to me, where they're traveling in the back roads, trying not to get seen and all that. And so the villages basically came to a standstill. People were afraid to go anywhere or do anything because of these enemy armies that had invaded them and were doing these raids. So it was pretty much a war zone, and these people were pretty much terrorized by the Canaanites. Until, though, Deborah shows up. And so she's singing about herself here, I, Deborah. And she arose, she stepped up in a way that no one else was willing or able to do. And she describes herself as a mother in Israel. And I was thinking about this as I kept reading through this chapter earlier this week. We don't really know if Deborah has any children of her own. And I don't know how to say that, but no biological children, we might say. We just don't know. We're not told. But she does describe herself as a mother in Israel. And so again, as I alluded to a few moments ago, Deborah's out there solving problems. So she's doing what moms do. She's resolving disputes. She's getting stuff done, keeping everybody going. Nobody made her the king, but Deborah is a fixer. So she loves the people. She loves the nation. And the people certainly seem to respect her leadership here. In verse 8, though, we see another key part of the cycle of unfaithfulness. As a whole, the nation, they pick new gods. And it's hard for us to imagine that. I mean, we see it in the world around us, but to think, okay, I'm tired of the old God. Let's pick new gods. All in favor of this God say aye. We're going to go with him or her or whatever. And just a bizarre situation here. But they choose new gods, and that's the final straw, it seems. That's what puts God over the edge. And so there's war, and these people, when these enemy fighting forces come through, they are completely unprepared for it. They have no organization. There's nobody in charge. Nobody has any weapons. There were no spears. There were no shields to be seen. They might have had some warriors, and I don't really think 40,000 is a huge number for a nation like that at that time. So I don't know if this was saying we only had 40 or that we had 40. But either way, they couldn't really do anything. They didn't have any weapons with which to fight. They were powerless to defend the nation. And so they were there, but they were useless. There was no defense. And personally, I'm thinking about the attack on Pearl Harbor so many years ago. We toured Pearl Harbor, as some of you have. We toured a number of years back. And I remember learning in the museum that day that on the Sunday morning of the attack, there were weapons in Pearl Harbor. I mean, they had guns and other things available to them, but they weren't available. They were locked up for safekeeping. And so they had guns, but those guns were locked in those big metal boxes on the decks of the ships, and they were inaccessible to anybody who wanted to fight back. And so, in a sense, they were almost powerless. So not only did they not see it coming or not recognize the attack when it happened immediately, but they didn't have any weapons. So they might have been willing to fight, but there was nothing with which to fight. I remember reading about one sailor who actually reached down. I think he was on the deck of one of the ships, and he reached down and he picked up a big wrench and threw that at one of the Japanese planes as it flew over the ship. I mean, that's all that he could do. I mean, he did what he could, but here they were surrounded by guns, but those guns were all locked up for safekeeping. And so when it came to manpower, they had the man, they didn't have the power. And I think we might say something similar about the situation during the time of Deborah. They had the people, but the people were completely unorganized. They had no weapons. They were completely, totally unprepared for war. So let's continue then with Judges chapter 5, verses 9 through 11. Judges 5, 9 through 11. My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, the volunteers among the people. Bless the Lord. You who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who travel on the roads, sing. At the sound of those who divide flocks among the watering places, there they shall recount the righteous deeds of the Lord, the righteous deeds for his peasantry in Israel. Then the people of the Lord went down to the gates. And so in the previous section, we learned the people were completely unprepared for war. Now we learn that when Deborah sees this, her heart goes out to the commanders and the volunteers. And so as the mother of Israel, she sees what's happening, and I think she's concluding, we're going to get slaughtered here. And so she's obviously concerned about this. And I don't know about you, to me, verses 10 and 11, it almost seems as if she's back in the present time. And she encourages the people to sing this, maybe sing it with her. And so she's described how bad it was. Now she invites the people to sing. And this goes for everybody, the travelers, the wealthy, the shepherds, the peasants, everybody. And the reason is these are the people who went down to the gates at the end of verse 11. As we've discussed in other places, the people would often gather at the city gates to talk things through. The gates were the ancient version of the city square, as we might say today, or as we might say in times past. I guess in Madison we still talk about the city square. It's still a gathering place downtown. I was kind of thinking earlier today, the gates were kind of the Reddit of the ancient world. It's where people went to talk and discuss the problems and issues that they were facing in everyday life. And so they would go down to the square, they would go down to the gates. That was their version of this. By the way, I remember visiting my grandfather down in Lynchburg, Tennessee, when I was a kid and watching old guys sitting there whittling outside the courthouse on the city square. I thought that was the coolest thing, that these old guys had knives that they were allowed to use in public. And being, from the Chicago area, I can't believe people are out there with knives in public, and they're actually doing something productive with those knives. They're whittling wood, and it just looks so neat. And I remember my grandfather joking, our town is so small, the city square only has two sides. Didn't really have two sides, but that was kind of his joke, how small was it kind of thing. And my grandfather, by the way, would love to know that I now hang out a lot in Oregon, Wisconsin quite a bit these days. And I think about him when I sit on the square outside one of the restaurants there, that the city square in Oregon, Wisconsin, it only has three sides. Three sides on the city square in Oregon. If you've been there, you know what I mean. It's kind of a triangle right there downtown Oregon. Anyway, the Israelites head out to the city gates. They meet there to talk and discuss things, hash things out, and decide a course of action. So we're at the city gates. Let's continue with Judges 5, verses 12 through 16. Judges 5, 12 through 16. Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake. Sing a song. Arise, Barak, and take away your captives, O son of Abinoam. Then survivors came down to the nobles. The people of the Lord came down to me as warriors. From Ephraim, those whose root is in Amalek came down, following you, Benjamin, with your peoples. From Machir, commanders came down, and from Zebulun, those who wield the staff of office. And the princes of Issachar were with Deborah. As was Issachar, so was Barak. Into the valley they rushed at his heels. Among the divisions of Reuben there were great resolves of heart. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the piping of the flocks? Among the divisions of Reuben there were great searchings of heart. In verses 12 and 13, we've got Deborah and Barak being called upon now to lead the people into battle. So I think maybe the people have spoken. We know God has called them to do this as well. In verses 14 through 16, we have references to the tribes of Ephraim, Benjamin, Zebulun, Issachar, and Reuben. So these people, or at least the warriors from these tribes, the survivors, I think one of these verses said, of these raids, the survivors, those who survived the attacks from the Canaanites, they join in, they volunteer to fight against the Canaanites, even though the Canaanites had those 900 iron chariots. So, this, in many regards, this is a death mission. We're going to go fight these people with iron chariots, and we don't have anything to fight with. But they're willing to go because of Deborah's leadership here. And kind of a side thought here, these people might have been willing previously, but they didn't do it previously. And the question to me is, well, why not? Why haven't they gotten this done already? Well, because they had no leadership. What was missing was Deborah and Barak being willing to lead the way. And I think we get a sense of this in verse 16, as Deborah in this song is pretty much asking, what were you guys waiting for? I think if I could put that into my own words, what are you waiting for? Why were you sitting there? Why were you just standing around looking? And she explains that there were great searchings of heart. That's an interesting way to put this. I should have looked that up in some other translations. But there were great searchings of heart. In other words, most people were just sitting around thinking about getting involved. So they're getting attacked by the Canaanites, and it just keeps on coming, and it keeps on coming. They don't have the organization, and they're just sitting at home rocking back and forth thinking, man, this is bad. This is really bad. But they're just thinking it. And so they had great searchings of heart. So they were thinking about getting involved, but there's obviously a huge difference between thinking and doing. And Deborah is really the one who makes all the difference here. Deborah steps up to fill this leadership vacuum, and certainly we're thankful for that. All right, let's continue with Judges 5, verses 17 and 18. Just two verses here, Judges 5, 17 and 18. with another couple here. Gilead remained across the Jordan, and why did Dan stay in ships? Asher sat at the seashore and remained by its landing. Zebulun was a people who despised their lives even to death, and Naphtali also on the high places of the field. So in verse 17, we read about Gilead. I think that was the land to the east of the Jordan, and they were just there. They didn't want to be involved. This is not our problem, all right? I mean, that's sad. In verse 17, we find Dan and Asher pretty much also refused to get involved. Dan stayed in his ships. They were apparently out fishing, didn't want to come in and fight this. So also with Asher, they stayed at the beach. Maybe they were fishing. Maybe they were transporting who knows what. But here at the end, Zebulun and Naphtali, though, they were all in. And they fought so hard, it was as if they hated living. They were so willing to fight for the nation. If that's what it took, they were willing to die in this battle. But all they needed was leadership. Again, they could have done this a week ago, but they didn't until Deborah gets involved. Well, this brings us to the battle itself as they start singing about this. So let's move over into Judges 5:19 through 23. Judges 5:19 through 23. The kings came and fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh near the waters of Megiddo. They took no plunder in silver. The stars fought from heaven, from their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away, the ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. O my soul, march on with strength. Then the horse's hoofbeats from the dashing of his valiant steeds. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord, utterly curse its inhabitants, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, to the help of the Lord against the warriors. Up in verse 19, we have a reference to multiple kings coming to fight against the Canaanite kings, apparently alongside the Israelites. We don't have much more information other than this, but they seem to show up to help in this. We do know that the kings took no plunder, so they weren't in this for the money. They were just there to help, to defeat Sisera. So the way I would look at that is Sisera, that guy, had apparently been harassing others. He wasn't just picking on the Israelites. And so once Deborah had the courage to step up and lead, and then the Israelites had the courage to follow her, the area king said, okay, we're in too. And so they jumped in on this also. In verse 20, even the stars came out to help. And so I think we've got some figurative language here. So also with the river helping in some way in verse 21, the horses in verse 22. And there in verse 23, we have this curse on the people of Meroz because they refused to help at all. They didn't do anything particularly evil, but instead they just refused to help. And that's terrible. And you can be held accountable for stuff we don't do. In James 4:17, for example, even in the New Covenant, James says that to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. So we talk about sins of commission and sins of omission. So there are some sins we commit, and there's some sins we commit by omitting or not doing something that we should be doing. And so it's possible then to sin by doing nothing. And the people of Meroz appear to simply refuse to get involved. And so there's a curse called down on them. Well, let's continue with Judges 5:24 through 27. The next little chunk here, these verses go together. Judges 5:24 through 27. Most blessed of women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed is she of women in the tent. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a magnificent bowl she brought him curds. She reached out her hand for the tent peg and her right hand for the workman's hammer. Then she struck Sisera. She smashed his head, and she shattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet he bowed, he fell, he lay. Between her feet he bowed, he fell. Where he bowed, there he fell dead. So now we get back to Jael, and so we have this retelling of the story in the form of a song, and it appears to be poetry here. You can see it. There's some rhyme and reason to it. I know it doesn't translate well from Hebrew into English, but you see some repetition of some words here. There is a flow to this. And as predicted by Deborah, a woman gets the credit in all of this. And Jael is praised in this passage, and in song form, this is something that's going to be remembered. This is going to be passed down for many generations. So Sisera, this Canaanite military commander, is the only one left. So everybody's been killed at this point. And he's on the run, and he sees this tent out in the middle of who knows where. And he runs in to hide, and he asks this random woman for water. But Jael goes above and beyond, doesn't she? Bringing him milk. And this brings us to the Wisconsin connection. Here we are. I alluded to this last week. But here we learn that she not only brought him milk, but in a magnificent bowl, she brings him curds as well. And I know, as fellow cheeseheads, you all know this already, I am sure, because you've memorized every reference, but this is now the third reference to cheese curds in the Bible. Okay, this is curd reference number 3. Here we are, to the third reference to cheese curds in the Bible. This is very important for us here in Wisconsin. So cheese curds play a role in the defeat of God's enemies. The enemy commander had cheese curds for his very last meal. And we can only picture that. This guy has been running, he's been fighting, he comes in, he's beat, he asks for water. Oh, have some milk and have these delicious cheese curds in this giant golden bowl or whatever. And he lays down, eats this, goes to sleep, and wakes up with a splitting headache. The other new information that we have in the song that we don't have in the text from chapter 4 is that now we find out Jael not only drove a tent peg through this man's head, but she also smashed his head, shattering and piercing his temple. So a slight, tiny bit more, little bit of information that we didn't have last week in chapter 4. And so this is Judges. I mean, this is like the rated R book of the Bible. If we put this on film, you know, kids would certainly not be allowed to see it. And this is the graphic scene that concludes in verse 27. The battle is now completely over. Sisera bows down dead between her feet, almost like, you know, submitting to her. And so once again, we notice that Jael gets the credit for this victory, just as Deborah had predicted before the battle ever began. And this was a direct result of Barak not being willing to lead the people on his own. And so again, this is the end of the battle, the end of the conflict between the Israelites and the Sisera. However, this is not the end of the chapter. If you have your Bible open, you'll know that there's more. There are a few more verses here. So Deborah continues. We have some bonus material because there is another woman that we have not yet considered. All right, so let's move on then, and let's conclude with Judges 5:28 through 31. There is an often overlooked woman here. Judges 5:28 through 31. Out of the window she looked and lamented, the mother of Sisera through the lattice. Why does his chariot delay in coming? Why do the hoofbeats of his chariots tarry? Her wise princesses would answer her. Indeed, she repeats her words to herself. Are they not finding, are they not dividing the spoil? A maiden, 2 maidens for every warrior. To Sisera a spoil of dyed work, a spoil of dyed work embroidered, dyed work of double embroidery on the neck of the spoiler. Thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the rising of the sun in its might. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years. At the end of this song, we have an aspect of this particular incident that isn't usually mentioned. We have what is basically an update concerning Sisera's mother. Isn't that interesting? I mean, as a woman herself, Deborah thinks about this from a mother's point of view. And, you know, Sisera's mother is pictured by her window. And it's been a while. And she's looking out, she's waiting for her son to come home. She's wondering, you know, why is it taking so long? Why don't I hear his horses coming home? I should have been hearing that by now. Like today we would say, you know, we can hear the garage door opening when we know somebody's home. You know, why don't I hear the horses? And Sisera's mom's attendants were assuring her, you know, it's all right, but she kept repeating herself. So she starts thinking, or maybe this is the servant's suggestion, you know, well, maybe they're dividing the spoils of war. We took so much in this battle that it's kind of taken a few extra days to sort through this. You know, maybe the warriors are taking a lot of time because there's so many young women that they're taking home as captives to bring home as wives. You know, at least 1, maybe 2 for everybody. And, you know, she's thinking, well, maybe my son's picking out something nice, you know, from the rubble. Maybe he's bringing a nice embroidered garment. That's what's taking him so long. That's what he's doing, is he's picking out a nice gift to bring home to mom. But that's not what's going on here, is it? Sisera is never coming home. His head is nailed to the floor of a tent, and his head is crushed by a foreign woman. And he died between that woman's feet. And so Deborah then concludes in verse 31 with the hope that all of God's enemies would be crushed just as Sisera was. And then at the very end of Judges 5, we have what should now be pretty familiar to us. We have this little statement here saying that the land was undisturbed for 40 years. So the land is now at peace, and it will be for the next 4 decades. So we are only 5 chapters in at this point. But what might we expect at the end of those 40 years? Okay, the land is at peace for 40 years. What's coming next? Well, a lack of peace, correct? But let's note, it doesn't say 41 years of peace. So, okay, we're heading towards something. Something's going to happen. So, in other words, they had peace, and that peace allowed them to get confident and leave God and do who knows what, resulting in being oppressed by their enemies yet again. So that's where we're headed next week. This brings us to the end of Judges chapter 5. So let's be prepared to take a look at the next judge in Judges 6, very famous judge, the fuel for children's Bible stories. A lot of stories from the next judge in the next few chapters here. So 1 week from today, if the Lord wills, we'll look at Judges chapter 6 together. As always, if there is something we need to be praying about as a church, if there's some way that we need to encourage you, if there's something we can say or do, if you have any questions about class, send an email to info@fourlakeschurch.org. You can also give me a call or send a text, 608-224-0274. As we close, let's go to God in prayer together. Our Father in heaven, today we're thankful for what we've learned through the life and example of your servant Deborah. We're thankful for her willingness to step up and do whatever it was that needed to be done during a very difficult time in the history of your people. We're thankful for the strong and courageous women in the history of our congregation right here in Madison. We're thankful for their faithful service, and we're thankful for their strong and steady influence through the years. And we pray that you would bless us with more women who have the spirit of Deborah in the years ahead. Thank you, Father, for Jesus. We come to you in his name. Amen.